The federal government opens its books for the first time since before the pandemic, and the pages are awash in more red ink than this country has ever seen. But according to the feds, there's no need to panic because the country has the fiscal firepower that other countries don't to battle COVID-19 and bounce back the economy. The opposition, though, says they're left with unanswered questions. In particular, how will the government do that, and how will they continue to help Canadians through this crisis, especially with the prospect of a second wave? We're going to get into that momentarily and ask Finance Minister Bill Morneau what he plans to do. Opposition leaders will also be here to react. And of course, the Power Panel is standing by to debate the implications of these unprecedented numbers. First, though, we want to take you through those numbers, everything that you need to know about this snapshot. To help us do that, the CBC's David Cochran joins us. He's gone through each of the 168 pages of what turned into a more substantial snapshot, I think, than maybe some of us anticipated. David, let me start off and ask you what you think, what are the main headlines? What are the main numbers that we need to know? Yeah,
I mean, we've never in the history of the country seen a fiscal update or a fiscal snapshot quite like this. From the math that the finance minister presented to the mask he wore all day walking around, we saw the impact of COVID and the cost of COVID, which is enormous. And let's start with the deficit. Now projected at $343 billion, 10 times larger than what they expected a year ago before the pandemic, the biggest deficit since the Second World War. All of that goes on the debt, now over $1 trillion to a historic high of $1.2 trillion, so a record debt, which is not unexpected when you're running those kinds of deficits. And the economic toll, Vashi, is the worst since the Great Depression. The economy is expected to shrink by 6.8% this year, based on a survey of private sector economists. And that, of course, means job losses, and the numbers there are just staggering. 5.5 million Canadians have lost their jobs or most of their hours. That's 1/3 of the entire workforce. You're looking at an unemployment rate for this year of about 9.8%, holding at 7.8% next year. According to the projections we saw today. And kind of the scary part of it, Vashi, is that there's a very real possibility these numbers could get worse. If there is a second wave, if there is a resurgence in COVID cases, that could prompt another lockdown, much stricter than the one we have now, and the need for greater federal aid. So these numbers, which are kind of backward looking, could become even worse if the government is forced to dig even deeper into its borrowing capacity to respond further to the COVID-19 outbreak.
I have a couple questions for you about what we didn't see in this, but first I just want to get you to explain, if you could, for our viewers, why we had been throwing out that number of $260 billion. The PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who's kind of the watchdog for the budget or for finances in Parliament, had signaled that's what he was anticipating. We saw the Globe report based on some economists' projections that it might be $300 billion. That this number, $343 billion, what are the big changes that got the government there?
Yeah, so there were two big policy choices from the time the PBO report came out to now that really spiked the numbers. One was the 8-week extension of the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, the CERB as people like to call it. That was announced after the PBO announcement. And there's a new measure in this announcement today, an extra $50 billion for the wage subsidy. Now, the details of that, we don't know yet how that's going to be rolled out, but essentially it's an expansion, an extension, and a retooling to be announced of the wage subsidy to make it more flexible and really more effective, because it hasn't quite had the take-up that the government wants. They want to move people to the wage subsidy as best they can. So they've only spent $18 billion on it to date. They're now budgeting $82 billion. So that's the reason for the difference. They've extended CERB, they've made the wage subsidy richer, and they also have better economic numbers. So you can see that the revenue is down a little bit more from what the PBO had, because really the finance department is going to have better data than the PBO. That's the reason for the gap.
And that you outlined on the wage subsidy, that's one of the sort of indicators we can glean from this about where things are headed. I'll be sure to ask the finance minister about a timeline. What are there other indicators? Is there other stuff in there that we can get a sense of where things are headed?
Yeah, what's really missing here is kind of what comes next, right? So we have two indicators. There is the extra $50 billion for the wage subsidy program. So that tells us right away at least the order of magnitude of their ambitions without the specifics. We know they want more people to take advantage of that, and they want to shift to the reopening of the economy using that program. There's another $10 billion in here as well for the employment insurance insurance program. So that tells us that they want to transition people off the CERB onto EI, and they expect an uptake there as people roll off CERB and onto EI. But what is not there, Vashi, is a full economic recovery plan. That is something the country wants, that is something the country needs, and that is going to be billions of dollars in new program and new spending once we get to the point where full economic recovery becomes the focus, as opposed to the emergency response, which is really what today deals with, the tally on that cost.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks for all the information. Very helpful. The CBC's David Cochran for us. So that's what's in the fiscal snapshot, but when will Canadians, as David points out, hear where the country's economy is going and if the government plans to extend or stop any of its pandemic emergency aid programs? Joining me from the House of Commons to answer those questions is Finance Minister Bill Morneau. Hi, Minister Morneau. Good to see you as always.
Hi, Vashi.
Minister, why didn't this snapshot provide any information to Canadians who are wondering about whether the CERB will be extended, whether their business will still qualify for the wage subsidy, or whether help for people with disabilities is ever coming?
Well, Vashi, let me step back and say that the intent of this economic snapshot was to give people a sense of what we know today, but not to give any hypotheticals about things that we might not know. In the case of all those three things you just said, though, we've provided information, and the snapshot actually gave some information. So we've told people that the CERB is extended, but we expect that will decline in importance as the employment insurance gets up and running. With respect to the wage subsidy, what you've seen in this snapshot is we've provisioned for our extension of the wage subsidy. So there'll be more details of that coming in the very near term, but we've said that we need to deal with that in a way that reduces the disincentives for firms to continue to grow, that provides appropriate support, and that does extend it so that we can actually get into a safe restart. And finally, we did in the document talk about the importance of helping people with disabilities who have been challenged. That was actually something that was in the document. There will be more work to be done with our partners in Parliament to get that finished, but it is absolutely our intent to support people with disabilities.
With respect, Minister, yes, you signaled your intent in those areas, but there is a lack of specifics for Canadians who, I understand you're presenting the big numbers, but who very much are affected by the numbers that you're presenting today. For example, a Canadian with a disability who's now waited close to 4 months for any kind of direct help from the government and still doesn't know when it's coming.
Well, I'm looking forward to having more information on that, I hope, in the very near term. What we've tried to do with this is to be transparent, to give Canadians a sense of where we are right now, and including how we're going to get to a safe restart. So you can see in the document that the $14 billion we've put in to have the discussions with the provinces so that we can get to those things that we need to do in order to get our economy back up and running. So that is very clearly there. Those negotiations are ongoing, ensuring that we will be able to get to the next step, which is so critically important.
Why wouldn't you, Minister, outline anything beyond that? And in particular, I'm thinking of the UK, which also tabled today a plan for, or a look at least into what might happen economically. They came up with very specific measures targeted at industries which have been particularly hard hit. I'm thinking of restaurants, for example. None of that is anywhere to be found in here. So if I'm a business owner or a Canadian worried about what my financial future looks like, I really don't get any kind of help or assurances from what I read or what you presented today.
Well, I don't see it that way at all, Vashi. I think what you see here is that we've taken an approach that has been very comprehensive. What happens in the UK, of course, is based on where they started out. They didn't put in place a wage subsidy for active workers the way that we did. So what we did is we put in place a wage subsidy for active workers, a very significant subsidy, and now you're seeing very clearly that we've provisioned tens of billions of dollars additional money so that wage subsidy can have a bigger and more long-lasting impact. So what we're going to do is, as we have the appropriate information to give to Canadians, we're going to be transparent. We're not going to wait for a budget. You're going to see this update, of course, gives where we're at right now. We've said quite clearly we're going to provide more information in the fall. That will help us to give Canadians, again, a clearer picture of where we are at that stage. Importantly, where we are now is what we want Canadians to know is that our economic and our health outcomes are inextricably linked. We need to continue to work together on the successful restart, and that's going to mean thinking about what we need to restart the economy, things like childcare, things like sick leave so people can be out of work if they need to, supporting municipalities so that transit systems can work and getting people back to work, and also thinking about how we need to be prepared as we get back to work. So things like making sure we have testing and tracing capabilities so in case we have an outbreak, we can get on it. Making sure we have PPE so that we can be protected, especially essential workers. Looking at how we support vulnerable people, whether they're in elder care facilities or people that are in shelters. And all these things are going to be critically important at the opening up, as well as the healthcare system be ready for any surges or outbreaks. So that is our approach, dealing with what we know as we know it and moving to the next stage as we can, and that's going to take us working together.
I understand that from the government's point of view, but for example, you say that in the fall a lot of this information will come out. If I'm on the CERB and I'm scheduled to run out of it, even with the extension by the end of the summer, finding out what happens next for me in the fall is too late. Will the CERB for sure be done after this iteration of the program?
There is certainly more that we will be able to tell Canadians as we work on the transition of these programs. The wage subsidy is something we've been very focused on for the last few weeks, and thinking about how that extension can appropriately support businesses so they can hire back workers. So that is in the very near term. We're working on how we can take the CERB and the employment insurance system and make sure we get back up to running appropriately. And there's still more work to be done. You've seen us, Vashi, all the way through this. What we've tried to do is rapidly get to program design and delivery that works. I think as a country we can be rightfully proud that not only have we delivered in scale, but with speed, so that Canadians have been supported. In the document you saw today, you saw that we've actually, with the income that's come out of the economy, people who didn't have income, we've actually put all that income back in, supporting people. So that's been a best-in-class response. And in order to keep doing that, we need to make sure we carefully get ourselves to an appropriate response at the right time.
I get that, but respectfully, that doesn't answer the question about the CERB. I know that you're waiting to see the uptake on the wage subsidy program, but it's right now standing at just about half of what your government initially anticipated it would be. When will you make a decision on whether or not people who will face life without CERB in 2 months will actually be able to access it or not? Can you just be straight with that?
Well, it's not a question of being straight, Vashi. It's a question of us doing the work in order to answer that question appropriately. What we're seeing with the wage subsidy is it's increasing in scale. So we now have 1 out of every 4 workers in the private sector working for a company that's on the wage subsidy. So that is very significant, 3 million people on it now. So that is increasing while the CERB is decreasing. And so that is the desired intent, and we think that trend on both of those will continue. And while we're doing that, we're making sure that our employment insurance system is ready to be restarted in a way that will support people. So we will answer that question appropriately when we have the answer. What I'm telling you is in the very near term, we'll have much more details on how the wage subsidy extension will look. And as we have more information on the CERB and the EI system, I take your point. It's important, and it's important to get that information out as quickly as possible, but it's also important to do it right, and that's what we're working on now.
Some of the specifics that your government and that you did provide today include the size of the deficit and the size of the debt by the end of next March. The numbers are certainly big. The Prime Minister was asked earlier today, and you were as well, about how you eventually tackle it. And I take the point that that's not the foremost concern right now at this moment, as people are still hurting. But you also ruled out, at least at this time, the possibility of raising taxes. I want to ask you unequivocally, though, 2 years down the road, when a vaccine is here, are you open to, or have you ruled out raising taxes then?
First of all, Vashi, with respect to the debt, it's not something that we are going to think about in the future. We're thinking about it now. So we're thinking about how we manage that debt now. What I'm working on as Minister of Finance is how we structure our debt to make sure that we have long-term debt, because it's quite inexpensive for us to have debt right now. The cost of servicing that debt is at an historic low. We're actually going to spend less to service that debt this year than we even forecasted even before the pandemic. So that's critically important. You're asking me about, whether we're going to raise taxes. I've been really clear that what we need to do is think about how we increase demand. We've artificially suppressed demand. We asked people to stay home. People didn't have their jobs. So now we're asking people to get back to work in a safe way. The last thing we want to do is to take money out of the system. So I'm being really clear that that's not something that we're going to do. And then your next question is, well, what's going to happen in years down the road? Well, actually, we're going to try and manage the economy in a way that makes sense. The good news is we have a strong fiscal position. We still have a strong fiscal position. We're going to try and work on growing the economy, creating jobs and opportunities. That growth, that opportunity for people is what's going to enable us to deal with this shock to our system. We need to work it through.
I see what you're saying, and I certainly do take the point that it's difficult to predict and put into a crystal ball what the economy looks like 2 years from now and what you're going to do 2 years from now. But it is a substantial amount of money, and I think Canadians maybe are assured by the fact right now you're saying that you're not going to raise taxes, but the way you describe it is very specific to this time. And so that's what I'm asking. If that calculation changes for you and your government at a time when things are not as acutely being felt by Canadians.
What you saw in our fiscal snapshot today is that we're going to have an historically big hit to our economy this year. It's a big shock. We have a significant decline in economic activity. People understand it's happening around the world. We're all facing it. You also saw, though, that the consensus of economists is we're going to have a bounce back next year. Now, I don't know that that is necessarily the way it is. It's going to be very much about our ability to work together and to deal with this health challenge and getting back to work in an appropriate way. But if that consensus view is correct, we're going to be able to grow our economy, and growing our economy is the thing that will allow us to deal with the challenge of that debt and servicing it and dealing with it over the long term. So we're going to continue to work on what we need to work on today, and that's
just to be clear, you're ruling out raising taxes in the future too.
Vashi, I know you want me to answer your question about a hypothetical future, but it is in fact a hypothetical future. What I'm telling you quite clearly is we are in the restart phase right now. We are going to get into a recovery phase, and raising taxes in those phases would be entirely inappropriate, so it's not on our agenda. So we will continue to focus on growing, creating opportunities, and as we have that growth, which we hope and expect, Canadians will be able to help us to get out of this shock to our system.
Okay, I'm out of time. I have to leave it there. Thank you, Minister Morneau, for your time.
Okay, thank you.
We decided to take on that debt to prevent Canadians from having to do it. If the federal government hadn't taken on significant debt, what would Canadians have done?
So where is the Prime Minister's plan to set us apart? The United Kingdom has a plan. France, Germany, South Korea, Japan, they all have plans. In fact, every single country in the G7 has a plan.
This government has now smashed through the $1 trillion debt mark, a deficit of $343 billion.
That is what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said this morning before his Finance Minister Bill Morneau dropped some big news. The government's pandemic aid programs have drilled a $343 billion hole in the budget. You heard reaction from the Conservatives' finance critic Pierre Poilievre as well. The net national debt will bust through the $1 trillion ceiling to $1.2 trillion by March of 2021. That's just next year. It's far above the Parliamentary Budget Officer's projection of a $256 billion deficit. But beyond those eye-watering numbers in the snapshot, there doesn't appear to be a plan yet to transition from emergency measures to long-term solutions to mitigate the long-term economic effects of the pandemic. How problematic is that? Time for the Power Panel to weigh in. In Toronto, Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance joins us. Summa Strategies' Tim Powers is in Ottawa, as is Kathleen Monk of Earnscliffe Strategy Group and managing editor of The Hill Times, Sherelle Evelyn. Hello, all of you. Great to see you.
Hello.
Hi. Kathleen, I'm going to start with you because I feel like this is fairly partisan to begin with, and I know that the NDP has put forth this idea of a wealth tax. But actually, apart from all that, I wanted to get your sense of how the government did today. Do you think this was a successful day for them in putting forth this snapshot?
Yeah, I do, because they pre-positioned this as a snapshot. It was a snapshot, which is backward looking. It was largely an inventory of programs and policies, many of which were unprecedented in terms of the rollout, the pace and volume that they've rolled out with over the last number of months. It was kind of an inventory of those. Some of these numbers we've even seen before. It did paint a grim picture, but it was the accountability that they needed to do. I think where they failed, and where I would give them a failing grade, is really the forecasting what's next, right? And we've heard that actually from the opposition leader just there saying, you know, what we're seeing in the UK, we're seeing in other jurisdictions, they're able to project forward. And really the only hint we got of that from this document, this snapshot today, was that there'll be coming changes to the wage subsidy program, but not the news that Canadians are waiting for. If, for instance, the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, is going to stop, how will the wage subsidy change? We have no idea what's going to happen. But I think with all the numbers, Vashi, that are floating around today, and to steal your line, some of them might be eye-watering, but the one that is truly eye-watering that we should really remember is, of course, the close to 9,000 deaths. I believe it was 8,700 deaths that so far have taken place in Canada alone. And that's the number and the context, really, in which the government and policymakers have rolled out this unprecedented series of programs.
It's interesting, Amanda, and as Kathleen lays out there, I totally understand the need was there, and I think that the criticism of the size of the package kind of falls a bit flat because of that. At the same time, I think the criticism of we don't know what's happening next, and it sure didn't become clear today, is also pretty valid. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I do think that Kathleen's right and sort of hitched on to the right premise of what they were trying to convey today, which was the snapshot and the fiscal update and providing Canadians with this lens in which to look at these huge numbers. And they are so extraordinary because obviously we're in such an extraordinary time. It's hard to wrap your head around those numbers. So I thought they did a good job of kind of breaking it down for people to consume. And maybe part of that communication strategy was, look, we're going to give you the lay of the land as it exists today. We're going to level set so that everybody understands where we're at before they move into announcements about the what next and the broader recovery efforts. And giving people context and time to digest that context generally allows people to also be able to consume those forward-looking plans when it's time to announce them. So I don't think that the strategy is that unusual, but I do certainly understand the criticism because we're all left to wonder. And there's this, there's a creeping anxiety when you hear numbers of those magnitudes and everybody wants to know the what's next. At the same time, the last point I'll make is that these are one-time extraordinary costs, and they are extraordinary, but CERB will end, and the wage subsidy will end, and the subsidy to seniors and students will end. These are not ongoing costs, and I think that was effectively conveyed today as well.
I think that's true, Sherelle, but I also think, and I sort of base it on the feedback that I get, that there are a lot of people in those groups who are affected by those programs that Amanda just referenced that are worried about that point at which they end, those programs end, and want to know exactly when so that they can try to plan. What did you think of the snapshot?
Yeah, well, I think there was an element of there being a missed opportunity. The government had a captive audience today. We'd be talking about this snapshot. They've managed to get everybody calling it a snapshot for weeks now, and they didn't take the opportunity to really go forward and say, okay, now that we have your attention, this is our plan, or this is a signal of our plan. Within the document, there were different scenarios bandied about with different economists saying, if we look to the future, if there's a second wave and it's really bad with the flu season, unemployment's going to be this much. If the recovery is a little better, but still not so great, it's going to be this much. I don't see why the government could not have done that same type of forecasting and said, well, okay, if we know that, it's going to be this bad in the future, we might have to extend the program and it's going to cost this much. So I think there was a bit of a missed opportunity there to really capitalize on the amount of attention that people were paying to today's announcement and today's document. Obviously, we don't know what the next steps are. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. But I think there could have been more of a signal aside from the $14 billion to the provinces and the wage subsidy increase or extension that we already know is coming.
Tim, I put questions like that to the finance minister, and what I could glean from his answers was that, and he kept saying we're waiting for the appropriate time to make those judgments, is that they are trying to figure out what the need will be. I think because they're looking to the wage subsidy and an expanded program, maybe trying to wait and see how many people subscribe to that, how big the need will be. I understand those points, but I also know for a lot of those programs and people on them, time is kind of running out.
Yeah, it is, because there are deadlines they can see that they currently know of. End of August for both programs, I believe, at this juncture, if you started CERB in March. But I got to tell you, Vashi, talk about trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. These two lines that are just leaping out at me. The Prime Minister, you played the clip earlier. We took on the debt so you wouldn't have to do it. Aren't we wonderful? Well, yeah, in the short term that helps, but guess what? We're going to have to pay for it at some juncture, because Amanda's right, they may be short-term expenses, but we still have this $1 trillion debt and this deficit. And at some point, Amanda, as she said herself a moment ago, these programs are going to end. So yes, spending will go down, but those figures are still going to be those figures. And the other line of the day, isn't it great? We can borrow, the interest rates on our borrowing are so low. Yeah, well, they're so low because the economy's crap and you still have to pay, you still have this $1 trillion debt. I tell you, though, the line of the day, got to give it to him. Mark Critch, I don't know if you saw his tweet. He said the deficit is so large you can see it from the naked eye in space. I'm glad there's some humor around all of this, but it is concerning. It's not so, you can't blame the Liberal government for it. The pandemic is not a partisan thing, but the way out, my goodness, can't just be spun this way. There are real fiscal challenges. You tried to get Bill Morneau to say whether he was going to have to raise taxes, what program cuts he may have to do. Those things are all going to have to happen. I just wish they'd say that.
Kathleen, I'm going to ask you from a strategic point of view, because this will become very political, right? Like this is so different than 4 months ago. Now you can already see today the various postures, depending on the party you're in, about how the government will then deal with the problem of, quote unquote, the deficit on the other end of this.
Yeah, it almost seems like, I was joking with a friend today that the government managed to roll it around $300 billion quite successfully. But then the last $1 billion with the WE scandal and everything else with the WE charity really seems to have kind of started the ongoing political fumbles. And I think that they're going to, as summer heats up, I think that actually the political heat is also going to turn up on the Liberals. They're going to have fights, obviously, with the premiers in terms of negotiating that $14 billion, what it's going to pay for, what it's not going to pay for. They're also going to have fights with the opposition, who are going to want more accountability and are going to continue to push them. I think it's going to get steamy here in Ottawa, not just because we're in the middle of a heat wave.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.